The morning mist clung to the French countryside like a shroud, masking the largest American military operation ever attempted on foreign soil. It was September 26, 1918, and along a 24-mile front stretching from the Meuse River to the Argonne forest, over 1 million American soldiers crouched in their trenches, waiting for the signal that would launch them into history. Private James Murphy from Boston pressed his rifle against the muddy parapet, his breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn chill. Round him, men from every corner of America farm, boys from Iowa, steel workers from Pittsburgh, immigrant sons from New York's tenements, all united in a moment that would define a generation. They had trained for this, dreamed of this, and now faced the most formidable defensive position the German army had constructed. On the Western Front, the Hindenburg Line stretched before them like a steel serpent, its concrete bunkers and machine gun nests carved into the hillsides with Germanic precision. General John Joseph Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had wagered everything on this offensive. The war had dragged on for bloody years, consuming Europe's youth in trenches that had barely moved despite millions of casualties. Now, America would prove that its democratic ideals could triumph over Prussian militarism. Behind the front lines, artillery pieces stood wheel to wheel, over 2,700 cannons of every caliber, from lightweight field guns to massive railway-mounted monsters capable of hurling shells 20 miles. The French had provided much of this firepower, but the men who would advance behind its protection were the olive-drab uniforms of the United States Army. They carried with them not just rifles and bayonets, but the hopes of a nation that had entered the war reluctantly, but now fought with fierce determination. According to historical accounts documented by the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Meuse-Argonne sector had been deliberately chosen by Allied commanders as the point where American forces could strike the most decisive blow against German logistics and morale. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, commanding the 304th Tank Brigade, checked his watch for the 100th time. His light tanks, French-built Renaults, sat camouflaged beneath canvas covers, their crews already inside despite the cramped conditions. Patton had studied every contour of the terrain ahead, every German strongpoint marked on his maps. He knew that tanks were still a new weapon, prone to mechanical failure and vulnerable to artillery. But he also knew they represented the future of warfare. The German defenders were no mere conscripts. The Crown Prince's army group held this sector with veteran divisions that had fought from the Marne to Verdun. They had spent months preparing these positions, laying barbed wire in geometric patterns, pre-registering their artillery on every approach route, and positioning their machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire that could turn advancing infantry into casualties within seconds. As the minutes ticked toward H hour, chaplains moved among the troops, offering final prayers and words of comfort. Letters from home were carefully folded and tucked into breast pockets, next to photographs of sweethearts and families. These men understood that many of them would not see another sunrise, yet they remained steady in their resolve. The war had reached its crucial moment. Germany's last great offensive had failed. Their allies were crumbling, and revolution stirred in the fatherland. But the German army still fought with the desperation of cornered wolves, and the Argonne forest ahead promised to be a killing ground, where American courage would face its ultimate test. At 5:30 in the morning, the earth itself seemed to rebel against the violence about to unfold. The American artillery barrage began with a sound that defied description, a rolling thunder that shook the ground for miles around and sent wildlife fleeing in terror from the forests. For 3 hours, American and French guns pounded German positions with methodical fury, each explosion adding to a crescendo of destruction that would be heard as far away as Paris. Private Murphy pressed his hands against his ears, but the sound penetrated bone and sinew. Round him, his comrades crouched in their jumping-off positions, faces pale in the artificial dawn created by muzzle flashes. Officers checked their watches, synchronized to the minute with headquarters clocks, while sergeants made final inspections of equipment that would mean the difference between life and death in the hours ahead. The barrage lifted at exactly 8:30, and whistles shrieked along the American line. Over the top, came the cry, repeated in a dozen languages by men whose parents had fled the Old World's wars, only to see their sons return as liberators. The first wave rose from their trenches like a great wave, fixing bayonets as they advanced into the morning light. Murphy found himself running across no man's land, his feet slipping on shell-torn earth that had been churned into a moonscape of craters and tangled wire. The German artillery response came quickly, shells screaming overhead, to burst among the advancing Americans with deadly precision. Men fell around him, some crying out, others simply crumpling silently into the mud. Yet the advance continued, driven by momentum and the knowledge that retreat meant certain death. The 77th Division, New York's own melting pot division, struck the Argonne forest with particular fury. These men, drawn from the diverse neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn, had trained together until they fought as one unit despite their varied backgrounds. Irish longshoremen advanced alongside Italian barbers. Jewish clerks charged beside Polish steelworkers, all united in their determination to break through German lines. Lieutenant Colonel Patton's tanks rumbled forward, their tracks clanking over the broken ground as machine gun bullets sparked off their armor. The Renaults were small and cramped, but they provided crucial support for the infantry, crushing wire obstacles and suppressing German machine gun positions. Patton himself moved on foot among his tanks, directing their advance with the calm efficiency that would later make him famous. The German defenders fought with the skill of veterans. Their machine guns, positioned in concrete emplacements, cut down advancing Americans with mechanical precision. The MG-08, Germany's premier machine gun, could fire over 500 rounds per minute, and German crews had mastered the art of creating beaten zones where nothing could survive. Yet for every position that held, another was overrun by American determination. By noon, the first objectives had been taken, but at a terrible cost. The 28th Division, Pennsylvania's National Guard, had advanced 3 miles through the forest, but their casualties mounted with each 100 yards gained. Companies that had begun the day with 200 men were reduced to fewer than 50 effective fighters, yet they pressed on, driven by officers who led from the front and sergeants who refused to yield ground once taken. The German counterattacks came swiftly and violently. Elite stormtroopers, using infiltration tactics perfected in earlier offensives, struck at the flanks of advancing American units. These were not the demoralized conscripts of German propaganda, but hardened veterans who fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in forest clearings, where American bayonets met German steel in combat that echoed the warfare of medieval times. As evening approached, the first day's gains were consolidated under the glow of star shells and the constant chatter of machine guns. The Americans had advanced up to 7 miles in some sectors, but the real test lay ahead. The German army had traded space for time, falling back to stronger positions while inflicting maximum casualties on their attackers. The Argonne forest had witnessed human conflict for centuries, but nothing in its ancient history compared to the mechanized slaughter that now consumed its depths. German engineers had spent months turning every ravine into a fortress, every ridge into a killing ground. As the American advance continued into the second day, September 27th, the forest itself seemed to fight against the intruders. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 77th Division led his decimated squad through undergrowth that had been twisted into nightmarish shapes by artillery fire. Tree trunks, some centuries old, lay shattered like matchsticks, their splintered remains providing cover for snipers who picked off unwary Americans. With methodical precision, the forest floor, carpeted with fallen leaves just days before, now reeked of cordite and death. The German defenders had prepared their positions with characteristic thoroughness. Machine gun nests were constructed from concrete and steel, camouflaged so expertly that American soldiers often stumbled into their fields of fire without warning. Barbed wire stretched between trees in patterns that channeled attackers into predetermined kill zones, while pre-registered artillery coordinates meant that German guns could drop shells with pinpoint accuracy on any position the Americans managed to capture. Major Charles Whittlesey, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment, pressed his men forward despite mounting casualties. These were largely New York City men clerks, taxi drivers, shop owners who had traded their civilian lives for the olive drab of the American Army. They fought with the tenacity of men defending their neighborhoods, each German position becoming a personal affront to their urban sensibilities. The battle for Hill 244 became a microcosm of the entire offensive. The seemingly insignificant piece of high ground commanded the approaches to the German rear areas, and both sides understood its strategic importance. The 35th Division, composed primarily of men from Kansas and Missouri, launched attack after attack against the hill slopes, only to be repulsed by concentrated machine gun fire and artillery bombardment. Private William Henderson from Topeka found himself pinned down in a shell crater with 5 other men, German bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets. The soldier next to him, a farm boy from outside Kansas City, had been hit in the shoulder and was bleeding steadily despite the field dressing someone had applied. Henderson could see the German machine gun position cleverly concealed behind a fallen log, but approaching it meant crossing 20 yards of open ground under fire. Historical records from the National Archives indicate that American casualties during the first week of the offensive exceeded all previous single-week losses in the war. Yet morale remained surprisingly high among the troops, who continued to advance despite the carnage. The artillery duel that accompanied the infantry fighting was unlike anything previously seen in military history. German guns, many of them heavy-caliber weapons that had been moved specifically to defend this sector, answered American fire with devastating effect. Counter-battery fire became a deadly game of chess, with observation posts calling in coordinates, while enemy shells sought their positions in return. Lieutenant James Morrison, artillery observer attached to the 79th Division, crouched in a shell-damaged church tower, directing fire from American guns positioned miles behind the front lines. Through his field glasses, he could see German infantry moving between positions, their gray uniforms making them difficult to spot against the autumn landscape. Each target he identified meant another coordinates radioed back to the gun batteries. Another salvo of American shells crashing into German positions. The tank warfare reached a new level of intensity as both sides adapted to the forested terrain. Patton's tanks, designed for open warfare, struggled with the dense undergrowth and steep ravines, but their psychological impact on German defenders was immense. The sight of these mechanical monsters crashing through obstacles that had stopped infantry attacks often caused German positions to surrender without further resistance. As the third day dawned, the American advance had slowed to a crawl. Every yard was contested, every position paid for in blood. Yet the pressure continued. Relentless and inexorable, German commanders, reading reports from their front-line units, began to understand that this was not merely another Allied offensive, but a sustained campaign that would continue regardless of casualties. October 1st marked the beginning of what would become one of the most famous episodes in American military history. Major Charles Whittlesey's 1st Battalion, advancing through the dense undergrowth of the Argonne forest, had pushed deeper into German territory than any other American unit. What they didn't realize was that their success had become their doom. German forces had quietly closed the gap behind them, cutting off their retreat and surrounding them completely. The men of the Lost Battalion, as newspapers would later christen them, found themselves trapped in a small depression surrounded by German positions on 3 sides and steep ravines on the 4th. 554 men from the 77th Division's 308th Infantry Regiment, along with elements of several other units, suddenly faced the prospect of fighting for their lives with no hope of immediate rescue. Whittlesey, a tall, scholarly man who had practiced law in New York before the war, quickly assessed their situation. His men had limited ammunition, no food beyond their individual rations, and wounded soldiers who needed medical attention they couldn't provide. Yet surrender was not an option, not for these men who had come so far and fought so hard to reach this position. The German response was swift and merciless. Artillery fire began falling on the American position with devastating accuracy, the shells bursting among the trees to send deadly splinters flying in all directions. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a former barber from New York's Lower East Side, pressed himself against the earth as shrapnel whistled overhead, grateful for every depression in the ground that might provide a few inches of protection. German infantry attacks came from multiple directions, probing for weaknesses in the American perimeter. The attackers were elite troops, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front who had been transferred west for Germany's final defensive effort. They moved with the confidence of professional soldiers, using cover effectively and coordinating their advances with supporting fire from hidden machine gun positions. Sergeant Ben Gedek, a German-American from Milwaukee who spoke his enemy's language fluently, listened to the shouted commands from the attacking forces and relayed intelligence to his officers. The irony was not lost on him. His own parents had emigrated from Germany 20 years earlier, and now he fought against men who might have been his neighbors in different circumstances. The siege entered its second day with no relief in sight. American forces attempting to break through to the trapped battalion faced the same German defenses that had stopped previous attacks, but now with the added urgency of knowing that their comrades were fighting for survival just hundreds of yards away. The 77th Division's remaining units launched attack after attack, each one costing precious lives while gaining mere yards of ground. Water became a critical concern for the surrounded Americans. The nearest stream lay 50 yards away, across open ground swept by German machine guns. Volunteers attempted to reach it under cover of darkness, but German flares constantly illuminated the area, turning night into deadly day. Men began to suffer from dehydration, their combat effectiveness declining with each passing hour. On October 3rd, the situation became desperate. German forces had brought up additional artillery, and the bombardment intensified to levels that tested human endurance. Trees exploded around the American position, their trunks shattered by high explosive shells that created an artificial clearing in the forest. The wounded, unable to be evacuated, suffered in silence while their comrades returned fire with decreasing amounts of ammunition. According to military historians, documented in the official Army history, the lost battalions stand represented, the epitome of American fighting spirit, demonstrating that citizen soldiers could match the endurance and determination of Europe's most experienced armies. Private Lowell Hollingshead, a farm boy from upstate New York, found himself sharing a foxhole with a wounded Italian-American from Brooklyn. Despite their different backgrounds, they had become brothers in the crucible of combat, sharing their last cigarettes and taking turns watching for German infiltrators. The wounded man, hit in the leg by shrapnel, insisted on maintaining his position in the firing line despite his injury. The German commander, recognizing the Americans' desperate situation, sent a message under a flag of truce demanding surrender. The note, written in English, promised fair treatment for prisoners and warned of the consequences of continued resistance. Whittlesey read the message carefully, then tore it into pieces without responding. His men, watching their commander's reaction, understood that they would fight to the end. As the fourth day of the siege began, ammunition ran critically low. Men were reduced to single shots, carefully aimed at German positions that had been located during days of continuous fighting. The wounded were armed with rifles taken from the dead, creating a final defensive line that would sell their lives dearly when the inevitable final assault came. The dawn of October 4th brought with it a tragedy that would haunt the survivors of the lost battalion for the rest of their lives. American artillery, attempting to support the trapped men, began falling short of its intended targets. The shells, fired by gunners who could not see their targets through the dense forest canopy, crashed into the American position with devastating effect. Men who had survived for days of German attacks now faced death from their own weapons. Private Krotoshinsky, despite his slight build and complete lack of military experience before the war, volunteered for an impossible mission. Armed with nothing but a message from Major Whittlesey and his own determination, he would attempt to reach American lines through German positions that had proven impenetrable to entire companies. The message he carried was simple but desperate. We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The Jewish immigrant from New York's tenements crawled on, his belly through German lines, using every depression in the ground and fallen log for cover. German sentries, alert after days of continuous fighting, maintained vigilant watch for exactly such attempts. Krotoshinsky moved with the patience of a man who understood that a single mistake meant death not just for himself, but for the 500 men depending on his success. Meanwhile, the siege continued with undiminished fury. German forces, recognizing that the trapped Americans were weakening, intensified their attacks. Stormtroopers, elite soldiers trained in close quarters combat, infiltrated the American perimeter under cover of artillery fire. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the confined space, with bayonets and rifle butts becoming the weapons of choice in combat to close for aimed fire. Sergeant York, though not part of the surrounded battalion, was fighting his own legendary battle elsewhere in the Argonne forest on this same day. The Tennessee marksman's single-handed capture of an entire German machine gun position would become one of the war's most celebrated actions, demonstrating that individual heroism could still triumph on the mechanized battlefield. Back in the pocket, Major Whittlesey organized his remaining men into a defensive perimeter that grew smaller with each passing hour. The wounded were placed in the center, protected by their able-bodied comrades who maintained firing positions despite their own injuries and exhaustion. Medical supplies had been exhausted on the first day, leaving men to tend their own wounds. With torn strips of uniform and improvised bandages, the German attacks came in waves, each one preceded by artillery bombardment that turned the forest into a hellscape of splintered trees and smoke. German infantry, advancing with the mechanical precision of their training, found themselves facing Americans who fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. Every yard of ground was contested, every position defended until the last possible moment. Private Hollingshead, now wounded in the arm by shrapnel, continued to fire his rifle with grim determination. The farm boy from upstate New York had learned to kill with an efficiency that would have appalled his former self, but war had transformed him into something harder and more focused. Each German soldier he could see became a target, each shot a chance to keep his comrades alive a little longer. The psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical danger. Men who had gone days without sleep, food, or adequate water began to show signs of combat fatigue. Some stared blankly at the German positions, their minds retreating from a reality too terrible to process. Others became hyper-vigilant, firing at shadows and imagined enemies until their precious ammunition was exhausted. Historical accounts from the Army War College archives reveal that the Lost Battalion's resistance had strategic implications far beyond their isolated position, tying down German reserves that might otherwise have been used to counter American advances. Elsewhere along the front. As evening approached, Krotoshinsky had somehow managed to reach American lines. His message, delivered to officers who had given up hope of communication with the trapped battalion, triggered immediate action. Artillery fire was redirected, and plans were made for a coordinated rescue attempt that would involve elements of multiple divisions. The German commander, recognizing that his opportunity was slipping away, ordered a final assault that would either overrun the American position or exhaust his attacking forces. The stormtroopers prepared for what they knew would be a desperate fight, checking their weapons and equipment with the thoroughness of professionals who understood that mistakes in combat were usually fatal. In the pocket, Whittlesey's men prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. Ammunition was distributed with careful attention to ensuring that every rifle could fire at least a few rounds, while the wounded were positioned to provide supporting fire from whatever cover remained available. The American flag, riddled with bullet holes and stained with blood, was planted firmly in the center of their position. October 7th marked the climax of the siege that had captured the attention of the entire Western Front. The Lost Battalion, reduced to fewer than 200 effective fighters, faced a German assault that would determine whether their sacrifice had meaning or would simply add to the war's already staggering casualty lists. The men who remained were hollow-eyed and gaunt, their uniforms torn and stained with blood. But their determination remained unbroken. The German attack began before dawn, preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage the trapped Americans had yet experienced. Shells of every caliber fell on the small perimeter, from light field guns to heavy howitzers that could demolish concrete fortifications. The forest, already devastated by days of fighting, was transformed into a lunar landscape where survival depended on finding shelter in shell craters. And behind the twisted remains of ancient trees, Private Hollingshead, now serving as a section leader after his sergeant had been killed 2 days earlier, moved among his men with quiet confidence. The farm boy from New York had discovered leadership abilities he never knew he possessed, organizing the defense with an intuitive understanding of tactics that impressed his officers. His wounded arm, bound with strips torn from a German uniform, barely slowed him as he distributed the last of their ammunition. The German infantry assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack that demonstrated the enemy's determination to end the siege before American relief forces could break through. Elite stormtroopers, supported by regular infantry and machine gun teams, advanced through the shattered forest with the disciplined precision that had made German tactics famous throughout Europe. Major Whittlesey, recognizing that this was their ultimate test, made his final dispositions with the calm efficiency of a man who had accepted his fate. Every able-bodied soldier was placed in the firing line, with the wounded providing what support they could from protected positions. The American flag, now so riddled with bullets that it was barely recognizable, was moved to the most exposed position possible, a defiant gesture that would inspire the men in their final moments. The fighting that followed was unlike anything in the battalion's previous experience. German soldiers, desperate to end their own ordeal, closed to within yards of the American positions. Bayonet charges met rifle fire, grenades exploded in confined spaces, and men fought with an intensity that left no room for mercy or quarter. The noise was deafening: gunfire, explosions, and the screams of wounded men blending into a cacophony that seemed to herald the end of civilization itself. Sergeant Gedeck, the German-American from Milwaukee, found himself in hand-to-hand combat with a German soldier who might have been his own age. The 2 men, both exhausted and desperate, fought with rifle butts and bayonets in a clearing that had become a charnel house. Neither spoke, but both understood that only one would leave this patch of ground alive. Just as the German assault reached its crescendo, salvation arrived in the form of American artillery fire that finally found its mark. The relief forces, guided by Krotoshinsky's intelligence and supported by every available gun in the sector, launched a barrage that fell on German positions with devastating accuracy. The attacking infantry, caught in the open by the perfectly timed bombardment, suffered casualties that broke their assault and forced them to withdraw. The relief column, led by elements of the 77th Division's remaining units, fought through the last German resistance with the fury of men who had watched their comrades suffer for 6 days. The breakthrough came suddenly as German forces, weakened by days of continuous fighting and demoralized by their failure to eliminate the trapped Americans, began to withdraw to more defensible positions, according to official records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The lost battalion's stand had accomplished far more than anyone had dared hope, demonstrating that American citizen soldiers could match the endurance and fighting spirit of Europe's most experienced armies. When the relief forces finally reached the pocket, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Of the 554 men who had been trapped, fewer than 200 remained effective. The wounded outnumbered the healthy, and every survivor bore the marks of an ordeal that had pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Major Whittlesey, standing among the remnants of his command, saluted the relief column with a dignity that impressed even hardened combat veterans. His men, many of them barely able to stand, maintained their positions until formally relieved by fresh troops. The professionalism they displayed in their moment of rescue was perhaps more remarkable than their courage during the siege itself. The German withdrawal, though tactical rather than strategic, marked a turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The enemy's failure to eliminate the trapped battalion had cost them precious time and resources, while the American demonstration of determination had psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The liberation of the lost battalion marked a turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. But the battle was far from over. As October progressed, American forces continued their relentless advance against German positions that had been strengthened by years of preparation. The cost in human lives was staggering by the offensive's end. American casualties would exceed 120,000 men, making it the bloodiest battle in United States military history. General Pershing, under enormous pressure from Allied commanders and his own government, maintained the offensive despite mounting losses. The German army, though retreating, fought with the disciplined efficiency of professionals who understood that every day they delayed the American advance was another day for their homeland to prepare for the inevitable. Each ridge, each forest clearing, each village became a battlefield where young men from both sides of the Atlantic paid the ultimate price for their nation's ambitions. The 77th Division, decimated by its ordeal in the Argonne forest, was relieved by fresh troops who brought new energy to the assault. The replacements, many of them recent draftees who had completed their training in America, looked with awe and respect at the veterans they were replacing. These hollow-eyed survivors of the forest fighting represented something new in American military history. Citizen soldiers who had proven themselves equal to Europe's finest armies. Private Murphy, one of the few survivors of his original company, found himself assigned to a training role with the replacement troops. The young man from Boston, aged beyond his years by weeks of combat, struggled to convey the realities of modern warfare to soldiers who still harbored romantic notions about battle. His lessons were stark and practical: how to move under fire, how to identify German weapons by their sound, how to survive in a world where death came without warning or mercy. The German retreat, though skillfully conducted, could not disguise the fact that their army was approaching collapse. Desertions increased daily, supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and morale plummeted as news of revolution in Germany reached the front lines. Yet the soldiers who remained at their posts continued to fight with a professionalism that earned grudging respect from their American enemies. Lieutenant Colonel Patton, promoted after his heroic leadership of the tank forces, found himself commanding larger units as the offensive entered its final phase. His armored vehicles, no longer the experimental weapons they had been at the battle's beginning, now operated with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The lessons learned in the Argonne forest had been applied to create new tactics that would influence armored warfare for generations to come. The final German positions along the Meuse River fell on November 1st, just 10 days before the armistice would end the fighting. The men who captured these positions, many of them replacements who had never seen combat before the offensive began, found themselves inheriting a victory that had been purchased with the blood of their predecessors. The achievement was theirs, but the cost had been paid by others. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. The Great War, which had consumed a generation of European youth and drawn America into global conflict for the first time, ended with a whimper rather than a bang. Soldiers on both sides of the lines stood in their trenches, uncertain what to do with the sudden absence of the sound that had defined their existence for months or years. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had achieved its strategic objectives, but the human cost defied calculation. American forces had advanced 34 miles in 47 days, capturing 26,000 German prisoners and enormous quantities of equipment. More importantly, they had proven that the United States could field, supply, and command armies capable of decisive action on the world's most demanding battlefield. Historical analysis conducted by the Army War College concluded that the Meuse-Argonne offensive represented the emergence of the United States as a global military power, demonstrating organizational capabilities and fighting spirit that would influence international relations for decades to come. The veterans who returned home carried with them memories that would shape American society in ways no one could have anticipated. They had seen the worst of human nature, but they had also witnessed acts of heroism and sacrifice. that proved the nobility of the human spirit. The Lost Battalion became a symbol of American determination, while figures like Sergeant York embodied the individual courage that democracy could inspire. The battlefield itself, scarred by artillery fire and littered with the debris of war, would eventually be restored to peaceful purposes. But the lessons learned in the Argonne farce about leadership, sacrifice, and the price of freedom would endure long after the last veteran had passed away. The battle had shown America's unbreakable spirit, forged in the crucible of the world's most terrible war. And that spirit would guide the nation through challenges yet to come. In the end, the Meuse-Argonne offensive proved that democracies, warriors could match the discipline and courage of any army in the world. The price had been terrible, but the victory was complete, and America emerged from the battle ready to assume its role as a leader among nations.